Now, some of you may be aware that it's been a little while since I've been really pissed off about Blue Origin and particularly their lunar lander system. But let's go ahead and review it again really fast. Here we see the Blue Origin lander linking up with what's called the transfer element from Northrop Grumman. It's a rocket, essentially, based on their Cygnus resupply ship. And then this last little bubble-shaped device is the Lockheed Martin Ascent element. So 3 parts in this contraption, 3 companies making their way to the moon. Now the transfer element takes the ship down into a low lunar orbit because the Orion is not currently capable of doing that. And then it releases the rest of the lander, and the transfer element goes off into oblivion, and the rest of the lander makes its way towards the lunar surface. Once it sets down, the astronauts will disembark for a 1-week adventure on the lunar surface. Now, Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos have always prided themselves on making space affordable, but let's see how affordable you think this thing is. This 3-company monstrosity. Oh, and by the way, there it goes. The only reusable part of this ship, which is made by Lockheed Martin, not by Blue Origin. By the time this is all said and done, it's going to cost over $10 billion. Not very affordable. But not to worry, SpaceX to the rescue. They have their new Lunar Starship, or at least the proposed Lunar Starship, which all of you I'm sure have heard about at this point, and it certainly will be able to take care of all of our lunar landing capabilities at a fraction of the cost. As a matter of fact, the total contract value is only $2.25 billion. I mean, problem solved, right? Well, not exactly, because for all of its capabilities, there are things the Lunar Starship simply cannot do that a traditional lander can. So what does this mean? Does this mean that we're stuck with a Blue Origin monstrosity, or is there another choice? Well, we're gonna find out in just a few moments. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. As you can see, I've swapped out my shades in the hope that nobody will recognize me after the debacle that we had with the live stream. No, it wasn't that horrible. At least I hope it wasn't. There are lots of people who participated today who said that it was still a great experience in spite of the technical issues we had, which pretty much just amounted to the fact that I couldn't get the damn thing to landscape properly. But in any event, we discussed where mankind might decide to explore after Mars, where we might decide to expand afterwards, and we had a pretty good 90-minute conversation about that, and a lot of participation from our Patreon subscribers, and a lot of you folks tuned in, hundreds of you anyway, and I want to express my deepest gratitude for that. All of that having been said, things are going to improve here, I promise you. As you can see, I'm back to using Bluetooth audio because the microphone that I got needs a little bitty tweak in order to make it work properly and like a real microphone. I recently finished watching a movie, one of my favorites, called A Bridge Too Far. And I feel like my channel is a bridge too far. Here we have a guy who knows a fair amount about space flight and space science and those sorts of things, but doesn't know crap about audio visual, about You know, the sorts of things that go into making a good YouTube channel. And unfortunately, the people who do not live in my city. So there's only so much help that I can get with these particular matters. And so all of this stuff is self-taught. And I have somehow surpassed 6,000 subscribers in spite of all that. And I want to say thank you. Thank you very much. Not only to the subscribers, and I wouldn't be here without you guys, but also to our Patreon supporters who have been recognized here as well. Definitely need your help, at least to make this a full-time career. With your help, I have now earned myself an extra month. I can go all the way till the end of August with this being my career before I'm forced into the job market, and I have every confidence that I'm going to build up this channel enough by that time to where that's not going to be necessary. So all I can say is thank you for your support. Keep the momentum coming, and bear with me as I continue to try to make this into a channel that's worthy of 6,000 subscribers, because in my opinion, I'm not yet. So all I can say is thank you for everything that you've done for me. Okay, on to the issue at hand. Or more particularly, what is pissing me off right now? Because after all, why the hell do we really need a lunar lander anyway? Apollo didn't have one. Why is it so necessary? Why can't we just take the Orion straight to the moon? And also, why is everything turning out to be so incredibly expensive? I mean, Blue Origin's always been about, or at least they say, they've been about making space affordable. And yet, $10 billion? I mean, that's about half of what the SLS costs. Now, a portion of that may be the deployment expenses, because the SLS costs $2 billion to deploy it in the first place, perhaps, or something along those lines. But still, it comes in at such a higher price tag than all the other competitors. And then finally, why can't the Starship do the job instead? What are the limitations of the Lunar Starship that make it an impractical substitution for the Blue Origin solution or the other solution offered by Dynetics? Well, let's get into that right now. Okay, this may look a little familiar to you. It is indeed the SLS, but a much older concept of the SLS, way back in 2013. And the Orion, or the concept of it, existed then too, way back in the Obama administration and way before Artemis. But at this time, the Orion was not supposed to be going to the moon. Instead, the Orion was a deep space exploration vehicle for human passengers. The Orion has more volume than Apollo, it has significantly more mass than Apollo, and most importantly, it doesn't have the ability to take off from a planetary surface, at least nothing like the moon's gravity. So consequently, it needs a separate lander in order to be able to set down on a planetary surface. This is just a multifunctional transport system to get the astronauts to their destination, but not to land on the surface. Very different from Apollo indeed. And as you can see, this thing may be heading towards the moon, but it isn't going to land on it. As a matter of fact, the SLS is completely incapable of delivering the Orion all the way to the lunar surface and then for it to return with the remaining propellant that it would have at its disposal. This ship has to have a separate landing system, otherwise it cannot set down on the surface of the moon at least. And so this is where the Lunar Gateway comes in. The Orion docks with the Gateway, and the Gateway in turn has lunar landers docked with it, or preferably just one lander, and this lander can be used multiple times so that the astronauts on the station can visit the moon at will depending on where they are in their rectilinear halo orbit. Now, clearly, NASA established a resupply contract with SpaceX and the Falcon Heavy and the Dragon XL in order to extend the astronauts' stay on the Gateway, thus allowing them to visit multiple spots on the lunar surface during a single visit. So the only thing that would be missing from this equation is a lunar lander that isn't reusable, which, by the way, the vast majority of the Blue Origin lander is not. And this, in my opinion, is what makes the Blue Origin lander so damned expensive. Not only the fact that they have 3 different companies contributing and all of them have to get paid, but also every time you want to send the astronauts down, you have to send a new lander and you have to send a new transfer element. Only the ascent element is reusable, at least at this time. So why the hell would we want to use this? Why don't we use the Lunar Starship instead? After all, it's reusable, technically capable of docking with the Gateway or docking directly with the Orion now that the Gateway has been taken out of what's called the critical path, at least for the first mission. I mean, isn't this the perfect way to go? Well, an article by Dr. Robert Zubrin, who by the way happens to be an experienced aerospace engineer, explains why Starship makes a terrible conventional lunar lander. Quote, Starship is estimated to have a dry mass of 100 metric tons. To refuel it in low Earth orbit to fly to the Gateway with its payload of 100 tons would require 300 tons of liquid oxygen and methane. This could be supported with 3 tanker Starship flights to low Earth orbit, but then to land on the Moon, discharge its cargo, and return to the Gateway would require a further 400 tons of propellant delivered to the Gateway, or 4 translunar tankers. Each of these would need to be enabled for flight from low Earth orbit to the Gateway by 3 further tanker flights, for a total of 20 Starship launches for each piloted lunar mission. Now, I don't agree with everything that Robert Zubrin says, but his skill as an aerospace engineer, as far as I'm concerned, is beyond reproach. His numbers are accurate. But all is not lost. Dr. Zubrin goes on to point out that there is an alternative Artemis application for the Starship that's extremely attractive. If it can be refueled in low Earth orbit, a Starship tanker could be put in orbit about the Moon and serve as an excellent refueling station for smaller vehicles. He goes on to say that these smaller landers would need to use methalox propellant like the Starship. The proposed Blue Origin lander is both expendable, he points that out as well, and it uses liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen propulsion. It would need serious redesign, but there is another smaller lander system that could make excellent use of the Starship as a refueling station. And I'm sure a lot of you guys figured that this was the direction that I was heading. The Dynetics lander was designed to be reusable pretty much from the start. The only thing that isn't reusable is its drop tanks, but if it's designed to use methalox fuel, then it could make very good use of the Starship for a refueling station. And Dr. Zubrin is a pretty big fan as well. Quote, the Dynetics configuration is more attractive as it is a single stage with drop tank system employing dense propellants with its HAB or other payload delivered close to the ground. This could readily make use of methalox propulsion. Zubrin then proceeds to crunch some numbers. He assumes a 3-ton dry mass for the small lander, the Dynetics lander, since the Apollo lunar module upper stage and cabin had a dry mass of 2 tons. This seems pretty reasonable. Employing methalox propulsion with an exhaust velocity of 3.7 kilometers per second, 12 tons of propellant would be needed in order to descend, land, and then return the Dynetics lander to the Gateway. A hell of a lot less than it would take to return the Starship. And then on top of that, it could refuel using the Starship as a refueling base and potentially return to the Moon 8 times. But what about cost? Well, according to NASA, the Dynetics proposal comes in at under 10% of what the total contract value of the Artemis project is, roughly the same as the SpaceX portion of the contract. However, the total value of the contract is over $5 billion. Why the discrepancy? Well, the easiest explanation is the fact that NASA assumes that the Dynetics system will have to be deployed by an SLS, but this isn't actually necessary. A variety of commercial rockets could deploy the Dynetics lander, including, by the way, the Starship. Now, by way of comparison, the Blue Origin proposal comes in at the 35% mark according to NASA, which makes sense given its $10 billion price tag. Even if you back out $2 billion or so for SLS deployment, it still comes in at 3 to 4 times as much as either SpaceX or Dynetics, and nearly double the price of the two combined. And finally, given its volume and its massive cargo capacity, the Starship would serve as an ideal beginnings to a lunar base, something that Elon Musk has already teased about on Twitter, talking about the Starship as the beginnings of Moon Base Alpha. Lots of different uses for this ship that doesn't have to be a traditional lunar lander. So, to review, we have a nimble lunar lander to explore the surface, we have a refueling tanker and the beginnings of a lunar base, and we have an overpriced expendable piece of junk that's more expensive than the other two systems combined. The choice should be an easy one, but given the power of the companies that Jeff Bezos has made alliances with, will NASA make the right choice? So I hope I've been able to convey to you folks that even though I love the Starship, and all of us do, and even though the Lunar Starship has many amazing and unique capabilities, there are some things that it simply cannot do, at least not efficiently. And there are other ships, like the Dynetics lander, that are simply better suited for this particular application. Now, the Starship can have a big role to play in Artemis overall, but in terms of being a lunar lander, it's just not the right solution. And I hope I made that very clear. And I think that we are misguided as SpaceX fans to think that the Starship is going to be the only space vessel of the future that can do any application whatsoever, no matter how big or how small, better than any other ship. It's just not going to happen. No ship is capable of that. And any ship that tries to do everything the best does nothing the best. And I think that Elon Musk is well aware of that. All of that having been said, the Blue Origin lander, I think I've also been very clear, is the worst possible solution to this particular part of the Artemis contract. And I'm going to put out a personal appeal to Jeff Bezos, because my videos are starting to get 30 to 40,000 views now. Who knows? Somebody who works for the guy might see this. Jeff, stop it. You've made these alliances with these companies that have made a living off of taking advantage of the American government and their procurement system. You say that you believe in making space affordable. This does not. It makes space unacceptably expensive, and we cannot have that if we are to explore the solar system in the future. Instead, what this particular proposal does is make Artemis far easier to cancel. The more it goes over budget, the greater the chance is that somebody in Congress or a new administration is simply going to axe it because it is too expensive. I don't think you want that. I really don't. So don't fall prey to these kinds of strategies. Instead, do what you said you were going to do. make a reusable and affordable method of getting humans to space instead of going things the old-fashioned way, the way companies like Northrop Grumman does. It's just not the way to go, and it's the way that's going to sabotage our future in space. And that having been said, I urge all of you to do what you can to reach out to Blue Origin. And who knows, maybe some of you work for him or know somebody who does. Pass this on, and above all, stay angry about space.